Back in March, there was not good estimates about how many restaurants could fail and how long the impact of the coronavirus would be. Initially, the estimates were only about 11% of U.S. restaurants may close for good, with the coronavirus devastating the U.S. economy. However, things have changed drastically in the last 6 weeks. Many restaurant chains, including the Cheesecake Factory, many Subways, and others, have had problems paying rent and have had to skip rent. Lately, the National Restaurant Association has come out with more accurate estimates, and just for the month of April, which just ended, an estimated $50 billion in losses by the restaurants in the U.S. for the month of April alone. And according to the National Restaurant Association survey among restaurants here in the U.S., some restaurants have lost 70% to 100% of their total revenues in less than 2 months. So the industry has already lost, according to the same research and survey from the National Restaurant Association, $80 billion in revenue so far. And it's estimated now, even with gradual reopenings later this year, that the losses for the restaurant industry in the U.S. will be $240 billion by the end of this year. And this is why the National Restaurant Association is looking for some type of bailout or some type of creative financing, maybe a loan fund similar to a low interest loan fund, similar to what the oil industry is looking for from Congress or the White House, because the SBA loans are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, especially for independent family-owned restaurants. This article was talking about problems when restaurants reopen, how a lot of people, the half-empty dining rooms, masked waiters, and how a lot of restaurants will have to focus only on takeout or delivery just to survive. But there's a lot of problems with that and why a restaurant cannot function if you're familiar with the restaurant business. So I have a lot of different articles here about problems with the SBA loans for the restaurants if you want to go more in depth, like this article, or this article, or this article, which talks about some of the problems with the SBA loan and how the costs for the restaurant don't line up with the guidelines for the SBA loans. How 75% must be spent on payroll in a certain amount of time. And that doesn't jive with the fixed costs and other input costs for the restaurant. And a restaurant is a very capital intensive business with a lot of costs, including rent, payroll. There's so many other capital, inventory for food. There's a ton of other costs involved running a restaurant, and profit margins are razor thin. Another article about problems with the SBA loans. These are chefs and owners of restaurants speaking out. Again, another article going more in depth. This one was from the LA Times. So there's a lot of different articles here, 5 articles if you want to go more in depth about this. And finally, to sum it all up, politicians now are forcing restaurants to partially open because these are politicians that often have no business experience, let alone any business experience running a restaurant. And they don't understand anything about the restaurant business, but they're still going to be ordering partial openings of restaurants in their cities, counties, or states. Many restaurants have to increase takeout or delivery now just to survive, and many restaurants are not doing that. Plus, it depends on the type of food the restaurant is serving. Some of the dishes are not really good for takeout or delivery. So a lot of restaurants are struggling mightily. I've talked about this for my Patreon account contributors, how one restaurant chain is offering literally 50% discounted pizzas and other entrees to try to survive. It does not look good for them how much they are deeply discounting. And then a restaurant is a very capital intensive business, and a partially open restaurant means that the restaurant cannot cover its cost for rent, labor, or payroll, and with a less than half empty restaurant. So restaurants need a lot of butts in the seats at lunch or dinner, or if they're open for breakfast. There has to be a lot of cash flow because of the margins. What's most important about the business normally is the margins. And restaurants are very capital intensive businesses with a lot of input costs like rent and payroll, but very razor thin margins. So restaurants have to have a lot of cash flow. There has to be a lot of sales turnover. And unfortunately, if you're going to have a half empty or less than half empty, a partial opening on a restaurant, if politicians are trying to mandate that, that's not going to jive with the economics for a restaurant to be profitable and remain open. If you want to go more in depth on this, there's really excellent TV shows I've watched over the years. Gordon Ramsay shows how to turn around a restaurant. So does Robert Irvine from Restaurant Impossible. Great show. And then Bar Rescue shows with John Taffer. So they show you how difficult it is to run and maintain a restaurant and keep it profitable. And most people are just not good at it. because of how difficult it is, the profit margins, all the different variables involved. It seems like it would be easy, but in reality, it's actually not to run a restaurant well. And for many business owners, it's just not worth the headache because the profits and the margins are just not worth it. It is not a high free cash flow generating business with really good sustainable margins. So the most profitable restaurants are ones that are constantly busy, not partially open. The politicians mandating partial openings of restaurants, they're not going to help the restaurants for the most part. Now, the restaurants that are going to survive are the ones that are going to adapt well to takeout and delivery until things get maybe somewhat close to normal again, whenever that is. So the restaurants that are doing really, really well with takeout and delivery, like a Chipotle Mexican Grill or some of these others, those ones are going to do well. But many restaurants are going to really, really struggle, especially if they have to do deep discounting, because that's going to destroy the margins even further. And unfortunately, the SBA loans, as they are currently designed, do not meet the needs of many independent restaurant owners. The chain restaurants are seeming to go after those. Some of them have handed the money back, but a lot of franchisees are not able to make rent payments to a lot of these larger chain restaurants. So it's a mess. The restaurant industry is a total mess. I think there's going to be a lot of bankruptcies in the not too distant future. And the odds are pretty high. The longer this coronavirus outbreak goes, the higher the odds that a lot less restaurants will come back. So I think your favorite restaurants, not all of them are going to be coming back in the months to come, depending upon how long this quarantine, partial lockdown, or full lockdown, depending upon which city and state you live in, lasts. So comment below. I know I have a lot of listeners who are in the restaurant industry who have worked there, but things are really, really bad, and the SBA loans do not seem to jive with how the restaurant industry works. Now, maybe Congress will tailor something, but I do not like the politicians mandating partial openings because the restaurants need to be busy to generate cash flow because their margins are not good.